Hey guys, welcome to ONX Estate. Today we're going to be going on a vineyard tour that's focused around teaching you about one of our favorite wines, Caliber. That's the Bordeaux blend that we produce here at ONX every year. We'll start off by talking about Cabernet Sauvignon, then we'll go into Petit Verdot and Malbec as well, and really circle around all three varieties that we use in this blend. Hey guys, welcome to our Tour de Caliber. So today we're talking about one of our club favorite products. It's our Bordeaux styled blend that we make off the estate here. Traditionally made from Cabernet and Malbec, although the upcoming release, the 2017 version, is actually going to also have Petit Verdot for the first time. So we're starting off here in block 105A, which is our home for what I would consider the most important component of an American-made Bordeaux-style blend, or meritage, as the other phrase that gets used a lot around here, which is Cabernet. So block 105 has our oldest vine Cabernet on the property. It was planted back in 2007, and that's why you can really see there's a nice thickness on the trunk of the vines there. But you might also notice that these vines are not quite shaped like some of the other ones you've seen on the property before. And that's because we've actually been in the process of converting them from bilateral cordon pruning, which is typically where you'll see them trellised with a nice thick trunk going across the bottom trellis wire. And you can see there's some residual of that. But each year, as we've laid out canes, we've actually started cutting off pieces of the original cordon. Now, the reason for that is really a word you've probably talked to anyone else who gardens around you about many times. It's balance. So the way we originally were farming this block, we just kept observing year after year. We got a lot more shoot growth and not as much fruit that came out of that. So really we had just too high of a pruning weight to fruit weight ratio, which led to maybe some more herbaceous flavors than we were really going for. A little more Pirozzini character, that sort of bell pepper flavor that you do see come from Cab and Cab Franc a lot. But in this case, by getting things more in balance, we've actually been able to really just enhance those delicious cassis flavors, that bright red fruit, and really hone in on getting just a bare hint of herbaceousness that really makes Cabernet, while still getting some just chewy, delicious, refined tannin structure as well, which this cab for me always produces really refined kind of small grain tannin. I like to refer to it as my 220 grit sandpaper, whereas some other cabs from Paso, as well as even say the Tempranillo in this property, really produces a much coarser grain, bigger grain tannin that for me is a lot more like a 80 or 60 grit sandpaper. Other things you might notice as we look through, you've heard me mentioning the phrase canes. Well, that's what this brown colored wood right here is, where you see it's just only got 1 year's worth of lignification on it. So this particular plant has 3 canes going, one here, and then one over here. It also has down here what we call a renewal spur, which is just something we can lay a cane off of in the future. But otherwise, in the near future, we'll be going through and shoot thinning, which is just where we rip off all of this little excess growth right there. And then basically, we're going to allow all of the existing growing fruiting shoots to go straight up through all of these wires, all these catch wires, and then they'll come out and flop over the top. Other things that make this block characteristically Cabernet, as you look at these leaves, you're going to see they're what we call pretty typical Bordeaux style leaves. Cabernet, Merlot, and Cab Franc all have pretty similar leaf shapes, which we always say the punch hole sinuses are what make them really recognizable from a distance. You see how the 5 parts of the leaf kind of overlap and leave little holes in there. And it's really, show you a larger one here, the shape of what we call the petiolar sinus that makes it really definable. So you'll see it almost has like a lyre or a harp shape right there. Other things, so you see all of the fresh growing shoot tips all have this reddish brown kind of what we call carmine color. That's very characteristic of Cabernet. And one other final thing I'd really like you to take notice of is all of these kind of pre-clusters, we could call them. So all these things that look like little grapes right here, they're actually unopened flowers. So each one of these in a few weeks is going to open up, and you'll have a flower that's pretty much just like a white pinhead, but even smaller. And then the pollen from that will gravity pollinate into the flower. It'll close back up, and that's what actually turns into the grapes that, you know, you see on clusters and see in the supermarket every day. So I think the first thing you're going to notice is just these plants seem a whole lot smaller than the last ones we were looking at. So this is for a few different reasons. Reason number one, this spot on the property is a little bit colder than Block 105. So you can see, I mean, some of these just bud broke like a week ago and still have very little shoot growth. Whereas the other plant, you know, the shoots are already getting 24, 36 inches long. One of the other big differences you'll see is this, you know, the trunk of this vine is only, I don't know, a third or so the width of the other vines. That's just purely a factor of vine age. So those other vines are approaching 13 years old, whereas these are only approaching, 4 to 5 years old. One other big difference is you don't have those big old cordons starting to come off the side. These have always been cane pruned. So it just has, each vine has 2 canes laid down, just going out to either side, following this trellis wire. And in the same way, this is just 1-year-old growth. So it's a growing shoot from last year that we then bent down and tied to the wire. But otherwise, this really grows similarly to the last block we were looking at, where you can see the freshest shoot growth. Those new growing tips still have that, reddish brown carmine color to it. You can see the shape of the leaves themselves are still those 5-pointed, 5-sinused punch hole sinuses and that lyre kind of harp-shaped petiolar sinus right there. And finally, even the inflorescences, so the unopened grape flowers, are still growing in the same manner. But one last difference that you didn't see in the other block is this right down here. So you may notice there's completely different colored, different shaped leaves growing off what appears to be a red, almost maroon colored shoot at the base of the plant there. So what this is what we call the rootstock. So almost all grapevines that go in the ground around here are going to be composed of 2 parts, the rootstock and the scion. Now the scion is the variety you're used to seeing on the label, what you're used to drinking, ordering off a menu. In this case, the scion is the clone 338 Cabernet Sauvignon. However, the rootstock is one of the most important features for really matching a plant to where it's grown. So in this case, one of the most important things, since the 70s and 80s, we've realized has been planting a rootstock that's actually resistant to the indigenous North American root aphid known as phylloxera. However, there's also other things where you'll match it up in terms of vigor, how wet an area is, what the composition of your soil is. So in this case, we're using 1103P, which has this red kind of growing shoot color along with what they call kidney-shaped leaves. But as we go through, we don't want the plant putting energy into growing all of this out when it's not going to bear any fruit that's actually going to make you wine. So we just rip it all off, throw it away. We can also rip off these little suckers that are Cabernet related, because again, you want it all focusing just on growing fruit from the growing fruiting shoots right up here on the trellising wire. right, so we're standing here in block 211, which is the home to one of the newer Bordeaux varieties on our property, Petit Verdot. Now you're probably telling yourself, I haven't seen that on one of the ONX labels yet. And the reason for that is we first started using it in the 2017 caliber. So it's going to be something that you will see in the near future for sure. But I wanted to introduce you to it because I do really believe Petit Verdot serves a super important function in American Bordeaux blend production. So it's what we definitely call a really important blending variety. Petit Verdot, while it does have its own sort of unique blue-fruited character, really shows itself in the structure. This variety just produces monstrous monolithic tannins, just super chewy, and something that a little bit can go a real long way in blend production. But you're always gonna know when you've had that. It also has heaps of color on it as well. So it's one of those varieties that I always call a tablecloth variety, because you can sort of have a good guess at identifying it just based on spilling a couple drops of the pure stuff on a white tablecloth. But as you look through, to me, the first thing I notice is all of these leaves are very differently shaped than the Cabernet leaves we were looking at before. Whereas all of those leaves had 5 very distinct sinuses. This is what you call more of an entire leaf or a whole leaf. It seems to be almost more circular. You do have much less, underpronounced sinuses, 1, 2, 3 of them, but definitely not the big punch hole sinuses that Cabernet displays. You'll also notice there's just a lot more growth, and part of that is this is an earlier bud breaking variety than Cabernet, so it's had a couple more weeks of time just to really grow up and start expanding. And you can see that as well just with these clusters right here. So the clusters are a little bit more spread out, a little closer to the flowers actually opening up. And one other thing, the shoot tips even, whereas in Cabernet, they're really red colored. Here, they're much more just kind of a light powdery white color. So again, there's no, right or wrong. There's no color a grapevine should be. They just all have little slight differences and variations that we can use to help identify them. One other thing you might notice is these guys are really moving around a lot. And that just speaks to the really strong winds that come through here. The Templeton Gap winds are kind of what we would argue are the most defining characteristic of West Paso as a whole, but also our particular spot here, which is, as we like to say, right in the shotgun of the Templeton Gap. So we get 20, 25 mile an hour wind gusts every afternoon, which is also why you'll notice these vines are shooting tendrils all over the place. So grapevines are essentially a really effective weed. They can grow just about anywhere, climb just about anything, and really latch on and make themselves part of the environment. So once a grapevine gets over like a shooting wire, a trellis wire like this, it starts to throw out tendrils just looking for something else to latch onto and make itself stable. So you can see this particular guy is really close. He's almost right there. So within another couple days, he'll have grabbed onto that wire right there and actually started wrapping around it. And you can even see, these are all of the tendrils from last year's growth that they grab on so well. Even when the shoot's done and gets cut and ripped off, those tendrils still hold on there. So a lot of times folks will ask me, why we're using barbed wire in the vineyard. But if you look close, you see it's not barbed wire. It's just leftover plant material from previous vintages. But I'm really excited to see what you guys think of the addition of Petit Verdot into caliber. Hopefully it just brings it up one more level for y'all. All right, so the last block I really want to show you guys today, I think is super apropos because the bottle of 2016 caliber that you received in your spring shipment is actually 55% from this block. So this is our oldest vine Malbec planting on the site here. So this originally went in the ground in 2009, And I really want to get into some of the nitty-gritty of how we planted this block because it's very different from the other ones that I've showed you. So if you go in and look, you'll see every other vine, it still grows out from the center of the row, but then it gets pushed to either the south side in this case, or alternatingly, it gets pushed out to the north side. And from there, we've run 2 cordons, again, going in both directions. And the end result is that ultimately we have 2 separate canopies or curtains of shoots going all the way up and down the row, overlapping. The reason for this is the lowest lying part of the property. It has a lot more water holding capacity due to the extra amount of clay that's in the soil. So if we grew these vines normally like we do our other blocks, it would actually have an incredible amount of vigor. So much we'd probably have to come back and hedge the blocks 4, 5, 6 times over the course of a year, which is really expensive. And as I mentioned with the original Cabernet block, if you have too high of a ratio of shoot growth to actual fruit coming off the plant, you just end up having really unbalanced flavors. In this case, growing it the way we do, it really just accentuates that purple, blue, sort of dark fruit characteristic, getting all that plum, blueberry, blackberry flavor, along with just that super refined tannin structure, which is why we use the Malbec, not just in caliber, but as a small blender into so many of our other wines as well. As far as looking at Malbec in general, some of the more defining characteristics. One, it has that sort of entire leaf shape, much like Petit Verdot, so it doesn't have as many pronounced sinuses, although it has a very toothy, jagged edge to it. One of the other things I always notice is that the shoots themselves, along with the rachis in here and even the petioles, all turn red and start lignifying much earlier than other varieties. So that's another good hallmark. You'll also see this is one of the first blocks to open up, as the clusters themselves are much more advanced in terms of growth. You have a lot more separation between different parts of the cluster already. The clusters themselves are each 3-4 inches long right now, whereas in the other blocks they were still wee tiny little clusters. But all in all, this is one of our favorite and I would argue most important blocks on the property. Thanks for joining me on this caliber-focused vineyard tour. We can't wait to see you again, and be sure to let us know which your favorite vintage is.